Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for joining me today. Very excited to talk about a lot of different aspects that you've been in without your career and now what you started at Providence. And I think I just want to start a little bit with your journey. And you've kind of been in a lot of different spaces in finance, but then also you've seen how finance can really impact the world in a lot of different ways. And especially now as, impact investing is coming much more to the forefront and top of mind, maybe in the industry, you've had really early look at what that looks like through your career and through your journey. So talk a little bit about that before Providence.
Absolutely, Grant. Well, first things first, thanks for having me here. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and it's an honor to be with you this morning. So my journey is somewhat unique, and I never knew growing up that I would have found my way into the finance industry and to run a financial services company. Growing up, I always knew I liked business, but the whole world of finance was very opaque and really a mystery to me. So the early chapter of my life and the early part of my career was really punctuated by being an immigrant. And my goal in life was, how do I stay in the country, get some semblance of financial security? So I wish I could say I was a visionary at a young age, knowing that we had to change our financial system to invest in biological systems. But through my varied experiences, which was really framed early on by being an immigrant, when I was younger, I was trying to figure out, what do I do with the rest of my life in a way that would give me those two things? And I had a childhood friend growing up who was 3 years older than me. And when I was a senior in high school, he got an internship at Goldman Sachs. And that was the first time I ever heard about the company Goldman Sachs. Being the nerd I was, I started looking into this company. And the more and more I dug into it, the more I realized how involved they were with every industry, every geography in the planet, and how capital really drove a lot of the industries in the world and the way those industries were run. Being me and being a little bit bold, I picked up the phone and cold called Goldman Sachs and asked their Philadelphia office if I could come in for the day and just learn more. And they were like, this is rare. This doesn't happen every day. Why are you calling us? And okay, maybe send us your resume. And if it's interesting, we'll get back to you. And luckily, I had a good resume at that time. I was president of Future Business Leaders of America on a regional level, and just had a lot of business history, even though I was younger. And they were really generous, and I have to really thank that Philadelphia office. They gave me a call back 3 days later and said, you know what, come in and let's have you shadow people for a week. And so I came in, and that was really the beginning of this lifelong exploration of what is this financial system that really runs our economy. And so through that, I got accepted into their undergraduate program. Then I got to do their sophomore rotational internship. And for someone who knew nothing about finance to then get an experience at one of the leading financial services firm, and opposed to just jumping into one specific seat, the beauty about their undergraduate program, the beauty of their sophomore rotational program is that it's really a generalist program. So I got to shadow in every revenue-making division in Goldman, whether it was investment banking, sales and trading, asset management, research, and I also got to look at all the non-revenue-making divisions. So at a really young age, I got this very unique perspective into what is an investment bank, what are the different components, and what functions do they serve in the economy. So really grateful for that experience. And then I went to a small liberal arts college named Williams College that produces a lot of investment bankers. So as I went to college, I started learning more and more about what the investment banking industry was. So that led me to work at Goldman, at JP Morgan, but I spent most of my time at Morgan Stanley. And at Morgan Stanley, I had the unique perspective of working in their wealth management division right after they acquired Smith Barney to create the largest wealth manager in the country with $2 trillion in assets. In that role, I helped build out a world-leading fintech platform for their 16,000 plus financial advisors. And I also got to harmonize their financial products. So I got to look at every asset class, every geography, every financial structure and said, do these make sense for our clients going in the future? What doesn't and should be removed? And where is the puck going? And what type of financial products should we have? And that's where I started interacting with impact investing. And, we're at this moment in history where we're going to see the largest generational wealth transfer in history. And, to put some numbers behind that, the millennial generation is projected to inherit $41 trillion from baby boomers. And it's no secret that newer generations want to invest their money differently, where they're not myopically focused on just financial returns, but they're looking for a more holistic scorecard to evaluate the success of their wealth. At that moment, I got my CFA, which is a portfolio management designation, and I moved to Morgan Stanley Investment Management, where I was helping investors create asset allocations to achieve their goals. And in that role, I heard impact again, where people were asking me for, these investments are great, but tell me about the impact. And if you find high quality investments that also produce impact, please come to us. We're starving and we want to hear more about it. So those were kind of my foray into learning about the finance industry and then getting the impact bug. And then I think in my own life, food has always been the most powerful vector. When I was a young kid and I had a shitty day in middle school, I would come home and my mom's cooking would restore my spirit. And then when I was at Morgan Stanley in sales, being young, I was 25, 27, selling financial products to people, sometimes 2 or 3 times older than me. And like, how is this going to happen? I'm smart. I have my CFA, but I'm still a little green, but I would take people out to eat and we would break bread. And it's amazing that when you find commonality and you find a way to respect and appreciate the person aside across from the table from you, business just tends to follow, and people like to do business with people they trust and they have a connection with. So for me, food restored my spirit, and it also gave me the community as an immigrant that, I was so starved for, that allowed me to be successful in my own career. So that was my experience with food. But, while I was working on Wall Street, I would also volunteer on the weekends, and I would volunteer with marginalized communities throughout New York. And what I quickly realized was the experience that I had with food, one that was restorative, one that built community, very rare. And most people actually have a negative experience with food. They don't have enough to eat. What they're eating is making them sick, or they're living in an area where they're exposed to really high levels of toxicity because of food production. And, that really stuck with me. And as I started to get financial security, as I got married and was really asking, what does the next chapter of my career look like? I started connecting the dots and said, look, here are generationally wealthy families, long time horizon money, asking to invest in impact. Here I have firsthand experience that our food system needs to be reshaped. And by doing so, we can give more people a positive experience with food. Why don't I go foray out and really try to connect these two pockets together? How do I get these long time horizon investors to invest in reinventing our food system? So I took that thesis and I went to business school at Berkeley Haas to really test it to see, was there there? And Berkeley was the perfect crucible for that exploration. And, Berkeley has so many deep roots in the organic movement.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I appreciate and was drawn to at Berkeley is one of the 4 key principles of Berkeley Haas, which is question the status quo. And there are different points in my experience in the financial services industry where, being inquisitive, I would ask a lot of questions. And, some of the questions were responded to, Adrian, it is what it is. And that always rung with me. And to me, I just really appreciate an institution like Berkeley, which appreciates that, yes, in some contexts, it is what it is, but don't let that stop you from questioning the status quo. And, being at this cutting edge where I really wanted to trailblaze and say, how do we change the way we invest in the food system? Because through my experience, I realized how capital really defines how businesses manifest themselves. How could I trailblaze on that and change the way the capital was structured to then change the way businesses were manifested? So while I was at Berkeley, I had the unique experience on being on their socially responsible investment fund. So getting the chance to be a portfolio manager of a pool of money and really thinking about what sustainability meant, not just in theory, but in practice. I was also on the board of the Center for Responsible Business. And Robert Strand, who's the executive director of that, just brought every thought leader in the space to Berkeley to talk about what the future of finance was. So through that, I got to meet Bob Eccles, who created SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, which is
Hmm.
trying to add and change financial reporting to be more holistic. I also got to participate in the CRB's Patagonia Case Competition, which that year was how do you scale and invest in regenerative agriculture?
Yeah.
And that experience ultimately led me to spend time at Patagonia working for them in their venture capital fund, Tinshed Ventures. And in that role, I got to write their standard for regenerative organic agriculture with a coalition of industry partners like Dr. Bronner's, the soap company, the Rodale Institute, one of the leading regenerative agriculture farms in the country, to really say the organic standard is great, but there's a lot missing there. And how do we create a regenerative organic agriculture standard which really delineates clearly what regenerative means? And
Yeah.
to us, it really meant how do you improve soil health? How do you think about fairness in labor? And then how do you also think about animal welfare? And then how do we create a high bar standard that allows us to say, this is what we define as regenerative, and anything less than this might have shades of greenwashing behind it. So I would say that experience was fundamental in my own journey because I got to read every agricultural standard out there and to really pick and choose what we wanted to preserve and what could have been done better. And then to do that in a corporate culture like Patagonia, which, slightly different from
Yeah.
bulge bracket investment banks, really showed me how I could do meaningful work that could impact an industry, but at the same time, have fun doing it. And, I can't tell you how great it was to work with everyone at Patagonia and the coalition of partners they brought to the table. So, that really was the start of my journey. And then graduating from business school, I met my business partner at Berkeley Haas. And, one thing I say is smart people are easy to find, but smart people with good hearts, that's a lot harder to find. So while I was at Berkeley, I had the fortune of meeting my business partner, FJ, Francois Jerome Salos. And FJ and I were the two people running around business school saying, we need to think about regenerative ag. We need to think about how we finance it. And our friends got kind of bored talking to us and talking about regenerative ag all the time. And they're like, Adrian, I love you, but there's this guy, FJ. I think he's more your speed.
He
Don't
will
talk to
listen.
him.
He will listen.
So FJ listened, and we got to work on projects together. And, not only did I realize that he was wickedly smart, he has a master's in financial engineering. He was a macro and credit investor at a series of hedge funds, but he also had a great heart. And to me, he wasn't in this to feel better about himself, but still keep the status quo. He was really trying to do this in a way that could impact the world. And that was the ethos I was bringing into it. So we became fast friends. And then as we looked at places to potentially join after business school, we just realized what was needed wasn't there. And instead of trying to join a company and
Hmm.
then try to build out a different part of that company, we just decided to take the plunge and to join a company, to start a company together. So FJ and I founded Provenance Capital Group to really focus on how do we get capital to flow into natural resources. And the reason why we focus on natural resources is that the time horizon of natural systems doesn't fit into a venture capital fund. How are
Yeah.
you going to put a tree into a venture capital fund? And it's not to say that venture capital doesn't have a space within the asset allocation. And I think for software as service businesses, for technology
Yep.
businesses, that model works really well. But what we were seeing is that a lot of people were creating businesses just to fit the VC model that wanted to be regenerative, but were the financial structure was at odds with the ability to be regenerative. And, me and FJ being students of the financial markets, we saw that right now the financial structure of vogue was venture capital, and that's the returns that people were, using as a barometer. Before that, it was private equity. Before that was hedge funds. And, every 10 years, there's a financial structure that gets a lot of steam behind it. And that that becomes a framing point. So what our goal was to say, how could we create a financial services firm that allows billions, if not trillions of dollars to flow into the space, but has the right structure to align with biological systems? So, and we can get into the PCG origin story. We can dive into a bit more to what we do, but I wanted to give you a taste about where I started, where I've been, and where I'm currently at.
I want to touch on defining, you talked about like trying to define regenerative agriculture, right? Trying to define sort of a new way of doing things. Many people might look at things differently, right? So how did you end up defining it, right? And what does it mean to you? And when you explain it to people, right? Because just how we both kind of have the same experience, I think, growing up, like not really knowing what finance is or like what an investment banker is. Like the whole world of finance is actually very neglected to most of the population. Like not a lot of people know how it works. And then you have to learn over life how to do that because schools just they don't teach it for some reason. It's weird. Anyway, but I think, regenerative now is sort of in this same kind of field where it's a term that I think maybe some people know, but maybe not quite understand quite what it can be and what it can do for our food ecosystem and our economy. So how do you explain regenerative agriculture to those coming into wanting to be a part of it?
Great question, Grant. And before I go into defining what regenerative means to me and how our firm defines it, you brought up a really good point there, which is a lot of people don't learn about finance when they're younger.
It's crazy.
And
Yeah.
that random cold call changed my life. But
Unbelievable.
if
Yeah.
you are out there and you are interested, I have to just speak wonders of Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, SEO, as well as MLT, Management Leadership for Tomorrow. These are programs that make inroads with underrepresented communities and make sure they get a chance to explore the financial services industry. So I just want to put that out there for anyone who's listening to this, who's curious but doesn't know how to get inroads in. Definitely check out SEO and MLT. So in terms of how I define regenerative, let's start with regenerative first, and then how that manifests in agriculture. I think the biggest thing for me is mindset. What's the mindset you're bringing to this definition of regenerative? And I had an amazing teacher at Berkeley Haas named Will Rosenzweig. And part of Food Innovation Studio was, what is the mindset you're bringing to food? And right now, the world operates in this mechanical and linear mindset where you start with inputs, you do something to those inputs, you then sell a good, it creates waste, and then you either put it in a landfill, you incinerate it, and then you start back at square one. And that's the model we're bringing to most of our economy. And what that produces is a lot of waste that we don't know what to do with. So instead of having this linear mechanical model, the mindset of regenerative is really circular in nature. And it really takes the playbook off nature and applies it to an economy. So like nature, there is no waste. All nutrients get created into something, whether it's a tree, whether it's an animal. And at some point, it gets recycled back into the ground and then gets put into something else. So to me, instead of having this extract and deplete with high levels of waste, we need to transition to an economy that's circular in nature, where we are thinking about what are our inputs, what are we going to create from them, but at end of life, how do we find a way to recycle them back into our planet and then have that start that cycle over again and to repeat that loop. And that's really the mindset that we're bringing to regenerative, which is to regenerative agriculture, which is, how is it circular in nature? How are we eliminating this extract and deplete and waste mentality? And instead, how do we move to a restore and sustain paradigm? So theory behind regenerative is that we've done so much harm to the planet up to this point that we can't just sustain the level we're at. We actually need to restore and rehabilitate our ecosystem, get it to a proper equilibrium, and then only then can we sustain it. So theory behind regenerative is that we've degraded our natural reserves and banks, and we need to restore them, rehabilitate them before we're ready to sustain them. So to me, I think those two concepts of mindset are really important, which is, how does the economy move to being fully circular? And how do we understand that we have pushed the planet past the point that we need to restore it and rehabilitate it before we can sustain it? And that's why regenerative is kind of the new frontier, and why just being sustainable isn't going to cut it when we're at the level of climate change that we're seeing right now. So that's a bit about the mindset that we bring to regenerative. And then when you think about that for food, fiber, and forestry, which are our three focus areas, you're really thinking about land bases. And there are certain techniques that mimic natural systems that we're not currently doing when we produce natural food, fiber, and forestry. So one is minimizing soil disturbance. Soil is a living, breathing thing. There's really so much complexity, and a lot of people, if they can't see it, it's not relevant or they don't believe it. But I can't tell you how much life soil has. Good, healthy soil is just teeming with life. In a teaspoon of soil, there's over, 1 billion organisms in it, and the complexity of those organisms and their relationship, it's mind-boggling. So, when people just look at soil and they think it's dirt, it's extremely different. And soil is a living, breathing thing. When you disturb soil, it kills the ability for those organisms to live because it just disrupts kind of the structure that they're living in. So, to us, when we think about regenerative, our goal is to minimize soil disturbance. We also want to maximize crop diversity. A lot of our food is created in these big monocultures where we're just growing one crop for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of acres. And when you do that and you don't have biological diversity, you create a perfect environment for pests to come in and to eat your crop. And, to solve for that, we've created caustic chemicals that have huge negative externalities, whether it's water runoff, creating dead zones in the ocean, killing pollinators. So instead of using pesticides and chemicals to preserve this monocrop system, if you switch to a polyculture where you have a good crop rotation and you have different pollinator habitats, you can use natural predators that can actively protect your crop because you're doing it in the right crop rotation and you have the right beneficial insect species to protect the crops that you're growing. So crop diversity is a huge part of regenerative ag. And then keeping soil covered, soil respirates, it breathes. There's a very complex relationship there. But if it's not covered, it's susceptible to erosion, to running off. And, one goal of regenerative ag is how do you prevent erosion and how do you make sure soil stays on the ground? And the best way to do it is to keep living roots in it all year round. And that's not a practice that's currently done on most large-scale agriculture. And then the last thing I would say for regenerative agriculture is, where are you getting your fertility from? Are you using synthetic chemicals that you're piling on? Or most regenerative agriculture, the goal is to get and integrate animals into it. And I think this is such an important point where cows get such a bad rep right now and animals get such a bad rep where people are saying, we don't need them. Let's just totally cut out animals from our food system. It'll be better for the planet.
It's part of the ecosystem, though. We just need to use it better.
Absolutely, Grant. And I'm so glad you know that because, Will Harris, I call him fondly the Albus Dumbledore of the regenerative movement. And he's kind of the lead farmer at White Oak Pastures, and he's doing incredible things in Georgia with regenerative farming. And he has this phrase, it's not the cow, it's the how. And if you put cows in confined animal feeding operations, it's going to create manure lagoons. It's going to cause high susceptibility of diseases. We're going to have to use antibiotics. But if you put cows in pastures in their natural habitat, they're going to be fine. And that ecosystem co-evolved with ruminants. So if you think about the Midwest and how bison and buffalo co-evolved and coexisted with that ecosystem, you realize that cows are a keystone part of that. And if you remove cows from there, you're going to end up with desertification. So one of our clients, the Savory Institute, and their land to market program, they've really shown that rotational managed grazing, where you have cows that you move in a pattern across the landscape that mimics their natural tendencies prior to the domestication of animals, that sequesters carbon, that rejuvenates ecosystems, and has healthy outcomes that produce food. So, animal integration is really important, and animals add a huge level of fertility to the soil and allows you to do it in a way that you don't have to extract it from a mine and then ship it thousands of miles to your farm to implement. So I know I've gone really deep into what regenerative ag means.
Yeah, no, I think it's important though. I think it's important when you're talking about these terms and, these big ideas and things that can shift the entire trajectory of our economy and really our race, right? Our species. I mean, I think it's important to understand it and go into the weeds of why these things matter. The one thing I want to say is that how, when we talk about these issues and these ideas, how do we implement them? Right? How do we actually solve these things when we kind of know what we need to do? But then how do we use the financial sector to actually implement and execute these ideas? So as you're talking to investors or clients and allocating capital to do this the right way, are you seeing that to being done the right way? Is it investing in, startups? Is it looking at public companies and trying to figure out a way to have them shift the way that they do things? It's probably a combination of both, but what are you seeing right now that can make the most impact, let's say over the next decade or so?
Absolutely. So as a firm, we have two core functions. I would say our core function as an investment bank is we raise capital for early stage regenerative agriculture companies or investment funds. So that is probably where we spend the majority of our time. And then we also have another part of our business where we help asset holders, whether it's family offices, foundations, donor advised funds, different pockets of capital, help build regenerative portfolios. So we're really working on creating impactful, investable regenerative opportunities through our investment bank and through our investment advisory practice. We're helping asset holders really understand how do they implement this and take it from theory to their portfolio. So those are the two coins of our business. To get the change that we need to see in the world, and for our listeners out there, there is this amazing report called the Soil Wealth Report, and it was published in 2019 by the Croton Institute by David Lesax and Josh Humphreys. And what they said is that we're going to need about 700 billion in capital to flow into the regenerative space over the next 30 years. And there's potential for this to create $10 trillion in net financial return, while also mitigating and potentially sequestering 170 gigatons of CO2. So in terms of just thinking about how much money needs to go into this space, it's in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions. I think they're being a little bit shy, and it's good to be conservative when you're putting a study out there. But to think about how much money needs to go into this space and how that can produce not just store value, but produce a return, all while sequestering carbon and having other ecosystem services, I think that is something that our firm is fully focused on creating the financial infrastructure for. And our goal is, how do we take our investor network? We have a very curated investor network of the investors out there, family offices, foundations, who are leading the charge on deploying capital in a regenerative mindset. And then how do we create and support entrepreneurs that are looking for capital to hone their businesses, make sure they're ready for growth, and then connect them to people in our investor network who are willing to change the script on how to invest outside the VC mold and to really invest into the timeline of biological systems. That's really what our firm is focused on.
When you look at we'll call them sort of like the factory farm sort of industry, right? And maybe the massive food companies, right? Maybe the big 3 or 5 really, really control a lot of the ecosystem and the way the food is delivered. They, the supply chains, how the infrastructure is built from that point of view. Do you feel like that you're like, not you personally, right? But the regenerative industry, is that like kind of war with them? Or do you see them as being a partner in this, potentially being a partner in trying to shape sort of the next economy to be regenerative, right? Rather than just like quarterly, right? Based on sort of earnings and based on, the sort of Wall Street investment model is quarterly rather than looking at, like you said, sort of the natural capital years of how that will work. How do you see them as a partner or an adversary?
Absolutely. I think the younger me probably have a more combative approach. But to me, I think talking about mindsets, it's really important to not have a scarcity mindset, but an abundance mindset. And if you have an abundant mindset and you are working in a regenerative system, that's really the ethos that you want. So, when I look at large multinationals they realize they need to change. I think the world needs both an evolution and a revolution at the same time. And we need these large multinationals to start moving these oil tankers in the right direction and to really move the rudders into a direction that's regenerative. And then we also know that we need catalysts to push them to do that work faster. And so when we wrote that standard at Patagonia, the Regenerative Organic Certified Standard, it's a high bar standard. And when we wrote it at Patagonia and we looked through our own supply chain, looked through their supply chain, it was going to be hard to hit. Just because we couldn't do it right out of the gate, it was still important for us to draw a line in the sand to say, this is where the world needs to go to. And even though it takes it might take us years, if not decades, to get our entire supply chain there. We need to do what's right and not just what serves our company the best. So, I think when we wrote that standard, it really sent ripples down the industry where greenwashing, incrementalism wasn't going to cut it anymore. And it really put into perspective the spectrum of where we were and where we needed to go, the huge chasm between, and to say that incrementalism is going from here on the spectrum to really close to where you started. But if you really want to be regenerative, this is where you need to get to. So to me, I think it's important to realize there are good people working at all these multinational companies who are trying to do good in the system they're in. And unless we change the system, it's going to be hard to have them move as fast as we want. So to me, I think it's really important that all these multinational companies, they're beholden to their stakeholders and their shareholders. And if the shareholders change what they are asking for, it gives these multinationals the ability to actually move in that direction or in a regenerative direction faster. So, to me, I think it's really important that we are all asset holders at some level. Yep. And the amount of capital that's held by pension funds that represent things like teachers, firefighters, if we can get those pools of capital to say, look, it's important to us for you to preserve our capital, to grow it, but to do it in a way that doesn't cause externalities where the world's going to have a lot of issues where our capital isn't going to be worth as much because of geopolitical warfare due to climate change. So, to me, I think both need to play their part and they need to make commitments to moving in a regenerative way, but we also need to change the system they're in. And to me, that really starts with who are their shareholders and how can we get shareholder activism into a new era where we're really giving them the leeway to start thinking more holistically and not just in quarterly earnings and short time horizons.
Yeah, I had a good conversation a while back, and the idea of sort of divesting was talked about, and how that they had experienced where divesting in companies had more impact than do sort of like not threats, but just like protesting sort of things, or like trying to do campaigns around certain things. It was like as simple as just like, you know what, we're going to take our money elsewhere. Like that speaks the loudest, right? Is just actually divesting in a company and then, going to someone like you or somebody else and saying, hey, I just divested. I want to move this capital from this company to something that is better, right? And that is more recommended for what I want to do. Is that something that you see at all?
Absolutely. I think the divest movement throughout American history, whether it was related to tobacco, whether it was related to apartheid in South Africa, had huge positive impacts in this space. So I think in terms of the methods that activist regenerative investors have, I think divestment is a great method. I also think there's other ways to also have activist investing, and another way is through proxy voting. When I was at Berkeley and a member of their sustainable investment fund, we started writing proxy statements and having people vote on things that were material and putting that up to vote for these companies, throughout the year. So I think that's a way you can engage with these companies and tell them what you want. And I think to take that a step further, I think what we should see more of are large shareholders like pension funds, insurance companies, and especially insurance companies who have a lot of exposure to climate change and, will probably be left holding the bill to say, we need to see this change. We are invested in this sector and we are going to, over the next 5 years, move our money to those actors who create the most change in the next 5 years across these metrics. And I think that's a really good way to, instead of just divesting, how do you influence large actors that even if you divest are still going to be in business? And so instead of divesting and taking your ball home and not playing the game, how can you actually influence the game? And to me, by having large shareholders come to the table saying, this is what we want and need you to do. And if you don't do it, we're going to move the capital to your competitors in the same industry who are doing it. And I think that would be the best way to get things to move as quickly as we need them to move based on what we're seeing on the climate change front.
I think that actually happened with Exxon last year. I think that they had some type of proxy where large shareholders came in and took over a board seat or something like that. I believe it was something with where Exxon, where it was a big issue around climate, and they think they weren't doing enough, and some shareholders got together and kind of made the choice for them a little bit. So that was really, really interesting. I'll end on the last question a little bit about the future and maybe what you're optimistic about and what you see on a daily basis. You have great insight on what's actually going to move the needle and what is moving the needle, and what we can see as consumers even down the line. Like, what can we expect, right? How can we expect for it to be easy on us to, right, go to the store and make sure that what we're buying is something that we can sort of be proud of, and not be difficult for us as consumers to have to sort of live a better life, right? A lot of the times we have to go out and seek and these decisions. We have to take time and kind of research, and then, oh, let's shop here instead of here. It's how do we make that easier too, is I think a big issue. But like, what do you see within maybe the next 5 to 10 years that we can see happen that'll be positive in the space of sort of food, but just regenerative economy in general?
So I think when I look at the space, I think what is really important from my vantage point is you have to invest in the system. You can't just invest in a part of the supply ecosystem. So, right now, when people talk regenerative, it's all about ag tech. It's all about consumer packaged good companies. And to me, show me the money, and that's where the money's being made. And that's why people are investing in those spaces. And that's why they're getting a lot of the love. So to me, I think one thing that frustrates me, but one thing that I love educating people on, is that you can have a regenerative economy if you don't invest in the system and you only cherry pick the parts of the supply ecosystem that have high margins. So, I encourage people to not just looking at ag tech, not just look at consumer packaged good companies, but who's doing the growing?
Yep.
How do you
totally
invest in regenerative production? And then how do you invest in regenerative processing? And, to me, COVID was just a shocking moment where we had millions of animals that needed to be harvested. You had store shelves that were empty, and processing was just gunked up and was hyper fragile and just broke down. So, this is not just about making money. It's about how do we feed our people. And to me, I think that's something that's really important, which is, should our food system really be left to people who are speculating, trying to make money, or should it first feed people and then really preference people who want to invest and create long-term return and to invest in companies, opposed to people who are speculating, trying to make quick money? So to me, I think there's going to be more and more conversations in the coming years about, should food be a speculative market, or should this be an industry, given how important it is to every single person in this country, on this planet, that should be protected from, some level of unabashed speculation. Also there is, our food system and the history of this country, there's a lot of socioeconomic injustices that have occurred. And as we think about what regenerative means, there's the soil health part, there's the animal welfare part, but there's also the fairness in access. There's also the fairness in getting additional capital. So to me, I think we're also on the cusp of really bringing the justice conversation into investing in this space. And if your workers don't have a living wage, is that truly a regenerative system? So to me, I think it's important for people to look at the entire supply ecosystem and not just cherry pick the high margin areas. I think people should also realize, what's the mindset we're bringing into allocating money into this space? And is it a speculative mindset? Is it a long-term investor mindset? And what role does justice and equity play in this when, the USDA admitted that they prevented a lot of capital going to Black and diverse farmers, and that happened, and they've admitted to it, and they're trying to change that, and they're trying to think about ways to absolve those past wrongdoings. But it's not a fair playing field out there. So how do we take that into account? But I take great inspiration from the companies that we work with, and they inspire me each and every day, and the leaders of those companies are doing heroic work. So, just to name a couple, on the production side, we're working with a fund called Fear Frontier, and they are helping conventional row crops move to regenerative row crops and polycultures, and they're doing it at scale, which hasn't been done as much in the regenerative movement. So to me, I see Clear Frontier as meeting the world where it is and changing this conventional row crop system into a regenerative version of it. And then in terms of processing, we're working with Creamco Meats out here in the Bay Area. What they do is that they work with the best regenerative ranchers and farmers, and they give them ability to process their goods and sell them to a variety of outlets, and to do that in a way where they're not squeezing farmers, but are really paying them what they need to do the good work on the ground. And then on, the consumer packaged goods front and retail and interacting with consumers, as a father of two under two, which is complete madness, but as a father of two
Goodness.
under two, the baby food industry is
Yeah.
ripe for reinvention. And the U.S. House of Representatives came out with a scathing report earlier this year saying that the leading baby food manufacturers, both organic and non-organic, are knowingly selling products with extremely high levels of toxic metals in them. And, as a father, that's just scary to know that they're knowingly doing this. And, this went all the way to the U.S. House of Representatives. So we're working with a company named White Leaf Provisions, which is a regenerative baby food company, but they've been on the forefront of testing their products for glyphosate residue, for heavy metals. And to me, it's really important that we're feeding people healthy things, and we're not just doing it from a marketing perspective, but we're actually testing and making sure that our claims are verified and that the consumer's actually getting what they're looking for and not just getting the marketing, but not the actual product. So, to me, I just wanted to pepper in some of the people that we're working with.
Hell yeah.
I think
That's
aside
great.
from
Yeah.
those Gary touched on, we're working with the Savory Institute and their Land to Market program. And what they do is that they connect regenerative supply to regenerative demand. And part of that is whole animal utilization. So how can they work with different types of companies, whether it's a pet food company, a meat company, a jerky company, to say, we're going to take this whole animal and you're going to make a leather boot out of the skin. You're going to make jerky out of the trim. You're going to sell the choice cut. And then how do we connect you to ranchers who are doing good work and who don't have the time to go to all these different companies and strike these different deals, who just want to sell a whole animal? And then how do you connect those? So the Savory Land to Market program is really one of the biggest catalysts that are helping these large multinationals figure out, how do I completely reinvent my supply chain after I made all these really bold promises of doing it by 2030?
Yeah. Amazing. I love talking about companies and what they're doing. I wanted to touch on one more thing, if you could, before we get off here. And we talked a lot about land, a lot about soil, a lot about regenerative on the land physically. What about oceans and water? Is there anybody, or do you look at that as a similar sort of mass thing that we have to sort of change and mature on, is the infrastructure or supply chain of how we do sort of, food out of our oceans, and how do we make that much more regenerative rather than the systems that are set up now? It seems to be much like the systems we have set up on land, where it's just constantly sort of taking and never replenishing. Do you think, do you go deep into the oceans at all, and maybe regenerative ocean companies or statistics, or just do you see capital going into that area as well?
Absolutely. I think the oceans are the next frontier. And, if you think about the ability of soil to sequester carbon, it's huge, but the biggest pool of carbon sequestration is really in the oceans. And a lot of people don't, in the way that they don't realize how much life there is in a teaspoon of soil, a lot of people understand how complex our oceans are. So in terms of the amount of carbon sequestered by kelp forests that are under pressure due to warming water levels is really important. So to me, our firm at this moment doesn't have a deep specialty in the oceans. And I think it's important for us at this early stage to be focused, and just touching all our land bases it's a lot to chew on. But to me, I do think that it is important that people start looking at our oceans and realizing that they're part of the equation, and a much larger equation that anyone ever realized. We can't solve climate change if we don't take care of the oceans in the right way. So to me, there are a lot of people who are starting to get into the space and to think about it more intentionally. So, Creo Syndicate is a organization that helps family offices invest in different impact industries. And one of my classmates at Berkeley, Maggie Freed, runs their oceans practice, and to really think about how do you invest in the ocean space. And then, when you look at S2G Ventures, which was one of the leading investors in reinventing our food system, they've recently started an ocean group, which is really focused on
Hmm.
how do you deploy money in aquatic industry. So, though it is lesser known than I would say regenerative ag, I do think regenerative oceans is going to be a much bigger theme in the coming years. And I think we're seeing a lot of leading indicators from experienced people in the space who are realizing that, they need to build teams to support capital to be deployed in those areas. And I do think our firm in the next 2-3 years will dive deeper into that space. But at the moment, our focus is really on land bases opposed to aquatic bases.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian. This was a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you taking the time with me and us, and best of luck the rest of this year and for hopefully the next decades to come, my man.
Grant, thanks so much for sharing this platform you have with us.